Okay, well, good morning, and thank you to Elsie for inviting me to this. So this morning, I'm going to talk about what I think is a revolution coming in the way Americans choose what to eat and also other parts of the country. I'm going to talk about three things. One, what's already here. Two, what I think is some predictions on what I think is coming. And three, on the challenges of regulating the market for emerging food technologies. So I'm using AI, or artificial nutrition, just as a shorthand for many of the emerging technologies, including big data, and the AI analysis will be part of that, nanotechnologies, that will be part of food and internal health monitors, GPS technologies, and additive manufacturing, or 3D printing. Okay, let's see here. So I am aware of what happens when you make predictions. They don't always come true. And here we see Variety magazine in 1955 suggesting that rock and roll was just a brief thing and it was going to be gone by December. So we'll see how my predictions turn out. So if there's one thing that the Dietary Guidelines Committee has been telling Americans for decades now, it's that they should eat more fruits and vegetables. However, as of now, only about 9% of Americans are actually consuming what the Dietary Guidelines Committee suggests that they do. So fruit and vegetable consumption is down. And we spend a lot of money in this country, particularly in the federal government, trying to educate Americans about what to do. And one of the things that worries me is there's not going to be a lot of money in the future, particularly from the federal government. So from 1972 to 2011, our discretionary spending, that's everything other than the non-discretionary spending, was about 8.7% of GDP. By 2023, that's expected to be down by 5.3%. So we're not going to be able to rely on more government money, I think. This is a chart that everybody is familiar with. Obesity is on the rise, as is diabetes, particularly childhood diabetes is very concerning. And in the private sector, Americans are spending about $60 billion a year on diets. And my point of these last two slides is somewhere between the government sector and the private sector, we don't seem to be winning. And so one of the questions is, why aren't we winning? Well, I'll give you my reasons, and I think people here may have all sorts of reasons. But I think one of them is that the science has become confusing for the public. We regularly get new studies reported out in the news, and the newspapers and the news journalists are not they don't discriminate between very good case control studies and perhaps studies that are practically anecdotal, and then they regularly get reversed, and I think that's confusing for consumers. I worked on food labels, and I have to tell you, I find food labels very confusing, and I think most Americans do too. They're very, very difficult to read in a holistic fashion. If you really want to use them, you have to do math and some tracking. Again, there's lots of diets. Most of them don't seem to work long term. The dietary guidelines, at least initially, weren't based on consumer acceptance, so they were very confusing for consumers. And since we now get 40% of our calories from restaurants, we've had almost no information in restaurants, and who knows whether or not we're going to even more confusing information. So I think that's the problem for consumers. They just don't know what to do. However, in my mind at least, there's good news. As Sam Cooke said, it's been a long time coming, but change is going to come. And here it comes. So this is just some of the new technologies that are coming, and let me just go over them briefly. So on the top left there, you see the Foodini, and this is a 3D printer or additive manufacturing printer. And I know some of you in this room are working on these already, and that one's already in German nursing homes. There's also in Israel there is a new 3D printer coming out from Yism, and according to them, it will mix, form, and cook personalized food using nanocellulose fibers as a base material to bind proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, as well as to control the food's texture. On the top right, we've had a lot of trouble trying to determine what people are actually eating. Recall data, as you know, is somewhat problematical. People are working on this, perhaps looking at cameras to take pictures of what you're eating, and then they look at how you chew or swallow to try to make a better estimate of what we're eating. So we'll have perhaps better monitoring there. I think particularly interesting on the bottom left is the Healthy Dining Finder. So this is a company where you send them in a stool sample, and they tell you, based on the restaurants that are near you, what you should go eat. They already have 1,000 restaurants signed up. And then finally, on the right side, we have monitors. Everybody's familiar with Fitbit, but my belief is that monitors are going to grow exponentially. And so let me give you an idea of what I think we're going to get. And this is probably them. 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 This is probably Ask me. And then there's gene editing. Everybody here has heard of CRISPR-Cas9. That's going to make us disease-resistant, disease-proof, and to repair defects. Enhanced memory and reasoning. So this is the brain-computer interfaces, which will also have augmented and virtual reality. And here's the one I really love: bionic limbs, prosthetic robot exoskeletons for speed, stamina, strength, who knows, perhaps even flight. I can't wait to be Iron Man. And finally, nootropic drugs to enhance thinking, and psychotropic drugs for mood and perception. So just as athletes today have different nutritional needs, so will enhanced humans. So that's another thing that I think is going to affect what happens. So how fast is all this going to happen? Well, that's very, very difficult to predict, but some of it obviously is already here. So if we think about how technology has been changing in the past, we can look at telephones. It took 45 years for telephones to get a 45% acceptance in this country. Dishwashers, surprisingly, took 50 years to get 50% acceptance. Now, move forward in time, cell phones took less than 20 years to get 90% acceptance. So things are moving very, very quickly. And with all these technologies, whether you're a producer, a farmer, a fisherman, a manufacturer, a retailer, or a nutrition advisor, a researcher, or a regulator, you've got to start thinking ahead toward these things. How are we doing on that? Well, New York Times reporter Thomas Friedman interviewed Eric Teller, otherwise known as Astro Teller. He's the CEO of Google X. And in his book, Thank You for Being Late. And Teller says, in the old days, customs, laws, and regulations would gradually adapt to new technologies. We are already past that. Jonathan Kay calls our current regulatory regime build and freeze. So here's what Kay says. At the core of this model is the assumption that any product may be clinically tested, produced, marketed, and used in a defined, unchanging form. He goes, that's over. That's why blood pressure machines look the same in pharmacies look the same way they did as a decade ago. So to get an idea of how fast this technology is moving and why it's going to move past our regulatory agencies, think of Uber or Airbnb or Bitcoin. These technologies did not wait for regulators. They jumped into the market. They went completely around regulatory agencies. And now if you watch the news, they're trying to catch up. They didn't ask permission. And I think this is what we're going to see. A lot of these technologies are going to move incredibly fast. And if you think about what regulatory agencies have to work with, they have the Administrative Procedures Act. In case you don't know, that was passed in 1946. In order to pass a regulation, it takes an average of about 4.5 years. With the speed that technologies are moving today, that is earthworm slow. So we're going to need to do something different, and we're going to need new science. So what science is needed? This is one way to think about how this artificial intelligence, these learning technologies are going to work. What will we need to make this work? Well, I think the first thing is, and as you see from this American Statistic News, we're going to need new ways of thinking about how we model these things. So we're going to need new statistics that are going to look at new patterns and relationships. Remember all those inputs that I showed you. Okay, so we're not going to be able to use our typical parametric models. We're going to have to find new ways to generate these associations. And this is a real key. We're going to need new biomarkers, and we're going to need reliable biomarkers that can be monitored and be quick. I don't know what those are, and I will certainly hope that the nutritionists are thinking about this, whether it's LDL or HDL or components of those, but we will definitely need reliable biomarkers. We're going to need to think about how do we divide people up when we get to personalized nutrition into subpopulations. Perhaps every person is a member of a different subpopulation, multiple subpopulations. These are algorithms. We're going to need algorithms to check algorithms, and I think that's certainly going to be a government need. We'll also need to decide, well, which illnesses are important, is it by individual? Which ones should we be shooting for to try to reduce? We're going to have to figure out how to incorporate both protective as well as antagonistic effects. And a big key, something that we really need and we need to jump out in front of, is we need to know how to govern these things. Okay, one of the things we don't want to do is draw the wrong conclusions. So you probably can't read what's on the bottom, but what it says is, if she loves you more and more each day, by linear regression, she must have hated you in the past. And he's sitting there going, why is this woman scowling at me? Do I know her? So we don't want to draw the wrong conclusions in these algorithms. And I think it's important to remember, as the astronomer Clifford Stoll said, data is not information. Information's not knowledge, knowledge is not understanding, and understanding is not wisdom. And in point of fact, while I'm sitting here telling you that a lot of this is going to be turned over to AI, however, in the near future, as Don Barnes says, most insights and significant advances will still be the result of trained, imaginative, inquisitive, and insightful minds. Nevertheless, the hope is with more and better data, better statistical techniques, use of causation instead of just correlation, and better biomarkers, we're going to get better predictions and better health. Perhaps we can solve these problems. So what's going to happen in the market? Well, there are going to be billions of dollars at stake. And some companies are going to want to jump in this market quickly. They're going to try to take advantage of uncertain science and perhaps steer consumers in the wrong directions. In fact, they may want to develop algorithms that point just at their products, good or bad. Maybe they want to develop new products, again, good or bad. And one of the problems with this kind of market is what economists call moral hazard. And that's when the producer knows a lot more about his own product than the consumers know. And so the producers have this problem of moral hazard. Well, they'll try to take advantage of that. And when that happens, we get what we call a lemons market. So a lemons market is something like used cars, right? Producer knows a lot about everything that's wrong with that car. You don't necessarily know. And that can drive the market into a lemons market where we're competing toward the bad instead of competing toward the good. So in this case, the bad products are driving out the good products. That's what we don't want to happen, because when that happens, eventually consumers will begin to lose trust in these systems. And I think it's also, in terms of management, we want to make sure that we manage it such that good companies are able to compete and they're not driven out by bad companies. Well, what will we need to manage that? I want to go back to biomarkers again. In order for these systems to learn, because remember, they're learning in real time, we're going to need biomarkers that tell us we're going in the right direction. I think also, because of this moral hazard problem, there's going to have to be some sort of reasonable access to this data to the larger public. I'm not talking about releasing private or confidential data, but there's going to be a call for some sort of release. And finally, I think it may help if we end up seeing third parties who rate these systems. One of the problems that we're also going to have to decide is, what's a bad outcome? Is it disease? In my mind, a disease is too long. They're talking about 3 to 10-year lags. I don't think we can wait for disease when we go to monitor these things. Perhaps it's the biomarkers are wrong. Perhaps your artificial intelligence is learning the wrong lesson from the data, or it's using weakly supported science, or it's overclaiming results. Maybe it's unable to work with other products. So if you think about Apple and IBM, the fact that they couldn't work together early on. Or for the data, maybe it's too secretive, or there's too much personal data at risk. Nevertheless, we're going to have to manage this. Hopefully, we want to have good competition. So, what kind of policy tools do we have? Well, in general, we always sort of break these down into hard law and soft law. So if you think of hard law is regulations and laws. They're created by governments, and they're enforceable. And so this would be prohibitions, pre-market approval, or user fees, regulations, licensing, and things like that. Soft law is more, this is one where people get together and they set standards, private standards, codes of conduct, principles, voluntary programs. So each has strengths and weaknesses. Hard law obviously is enforceable. You can crank down on bad actors and get them out of the market. But it's very, very slow. As I said, if it's a regulation, it takes 4.5 years. With laws, as you know, many laws are introduced, and sometimes it takes 6 or 7 Congresses before they actually enforce them. Soft law, on the other hand, is very malleable, can be done very quickly, but it's not enforceable. So that's a difficulty. People have already jumped into the space to decide what's needed. So in a recent administrative law review, Andrew Tutt argued that the rise of these complex algorithms for health means that we need 4 things. He says, we need federal uniformity, we need expert judgment, we need political independence. By that he means regulatory agencies. And he says we need pre-market review. By that he actually means pre-market approval based on evidence-based pre-market trials. And he argues we can have all this without stifling innovation. However, pre-market approval is precisely what we have now for a lot of products. We have pre-market approval for drugs, for medical devices, for food and color additives, but not for foods. So how is that working out? Well, for drugs, it costs an average of about $1.3 billion. You can read an average of up to $2.5 billion for an individual drug to bring it to market. And it takes about an average of 12 years to bring a new drug, new molecular entity onto the market. Medical devices takes about $24 million, again, average of about 1 year to bring it to market. Food and color additives, I found one quote, can take up over 5 years on average to bring those to market, and about $830,000. And this pre-market approval is focused solely on preventing false negative errors, assuming something's safe when it's not safe. There's another thing that happens with pre-market approval, and that is they tend to have user fees. More and more Congress has been going for that. So for drugs, for example, user fees started off as a few $100,000 in 1993 to over $3 million in 2016. Well, how much innovation do we get in these markets? Well, for drugs, we're getting about 40 new drugs every year. Medical devices, we're getting about 100 every year. Not sure how many food and color additives, but obviously with foods, whereas in 1965 we were getting a few thousand products introduced every year, last year we got over 20,000. So if we had pre-market approval, think about what's been going on with pre-market approval now. 23andMe was kept off the market for over 2 years, perhaps appropriately, I don't know, but now the results of that, all of that big data is being used to study Parkinson's disease. So here's a key difference between these products, for which we have pre-market approval, and the artificial intelligence products that I'm talking about. With drugs, medical devices, and additives, we wanted to wait to put these things on the market until we knew they were safe. We wanted to wait for the science. With the artificial intelligence, that is the science. It doesn't make any sense to wait because that's going to take the data, it's going to crunch it, and it's going to provide basically research. So it doesn't make as much sense for those to wait for the science, which is why I think perhaps pre-market approval might be a bad idea. Well, how will we decide how to regulate these things? And I guess being an economist, I want to argue that I think benefit-cost analysis can help. So benefit-cost analysis has been around the government since the 1960s when the Army Corps of Engineers began to use it at the insistence of President Truman. And then in 1980, between President Carter and President Reagan, they formalized it for all the executive branch agencies. And every single president since then has endorsed the use of cost-benefit analysis or benefit-cost analysis. And what is it? It's just simply a tool. It's an analytical tool, and it evaluates the different ways to solve problems by estimating the benefits and costs of each of our regulatory options. So just to give you an idea of how it works, So you always have to start with a problem. And having been in a regulatory agency, I find that's always interesting, because often in the meetings I would go to, we started off and saying, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is something's not regulated. That's actually not a problem. The problem is that we have a public health problem, for example. So you need a well-defined problem, such as some artificial intelligence devices are causing a certain type of consumers to gain excessive weight. So that's something you can handle, and you can start looking at, well, how do we solve that problem? So the next thing we look at are the baselines. Okay, well, what's causing this problem? What are consumers doing? What are producers doing that is causing this problem? And one of the things that economists will typically ask that others won't was, okay, that's what's causing the problem up to now. Will it solve itself? If we just leave it alone, will the market solve it? Because sometimes within a very few years, the market will solve a problem. I remember a few years ago, the head of the Department of Transportation was lamenting. He goes, you know, every time I start a regulation, we finish it in a little over 4 years, and by the time we get the regulation out, the problem's already been solved. Oh, what a terrible thing. So we know what people are doing now, and then we say, well, what can we do about this? And there's always more than one way to solve a problem, so we have to think about legal requirements. So that would be something like, well, let's make people release information, or let's have a regulation to have a standard. So there are multiple legal requirements. But those are not the same as what people do. I'll just give you an example. Years ago, when we had a problem with raw juice, and it was particularly apple juice that was causing kids to get sick, one of the first things that we did was we said, well, let's put a label on that. And the label said, if your kids drink this juice, they're probably going to die. It was something like that. Well, how many people do you suppose actually put that label on raw juice? Not many. So what they did is they changed it. They began to process it, to heat it, and so forth. So we have to look at not just what the legal requirements are, but how will people actually react to that? And the reaction by producers and consumers, however people change their behavior, that's what sort of gives rise to the costs and the benefits. So we look at the costs and the benefits of every single requirement and change in practices. And then at the end we say, okay, well, let's look at the quantified benefits. How do the quantified benefits look compared to the costs? And economists would recommend that you choose the option, the requirements, for which benefits exceed costs by the largest amount. So there's a lot of misconceptions about benefit-cost analysis. Let me just go over a few of them. One thing is people don't understand, well, you know, why is it that we even do this? Well, if you think about the information that needs to go into these decisions, it's a lot of different kinds of information, a lot of science information, cost information. And one of the things that benefit-cost analysis, and I would argue risk assessment, tend to do as well, is it organizes facts in a way that makes them usable, makes them compatible. So it puts different kinds of science together. Often, because there is uncertainty in benefit-cost analysis, just like risk assessment or any science, there is uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, you can either make an assumption about that or you can go out and get more information. So it often says we need more information before we can make an intelligent decision. It does contain uncertainty. We do have assumptions, but also variability. So every one of these decisions that we make, it affects people in different ways, and you want to know. Quite often, for a lot of decisions, the people that get the benefits of a regulatory decision are completely different than the people that bear the costs, and we want to let decision makers know this. In terms of misconceptions, the biggest one that you'll read is, well, you have these analysts, economic analysts, making decisions. So it's not true. I can tell you, as a former analyst and then a person who led those things, they don't pay you enough money to make those decisions, and in fact, you don't. So these are decision aids, and there are lots of reasons to make decisions other than just in economic analysis. Perhaps it's the law setting a precedent, maybe it's morality, maybe it's politics, maybe it's agency resources. So that's a key. So I think benefit-cost analysis can help, but I think when we come to these technologies, and this is from The Techno-Human Condition by Allenby and Sarowitz, there's also deeper questions that we're going to have to think about. So we can start first level, and we can say, will this technology work as designed? Perhaps. We might look at the probability of a good outcome versus the probability of a bad outcome. What are the benefits? Are the benefits of a good outcome versus costs of a bad outcome? So at the first level, we want to know, is the technology going to work? At the second level, when you go a little deeper, you go, well, wait a minute. Are there unintended effects that we haven't thought about? And one of the ones, almost certainly, when we get these new technologies, is there are going to be inequalities. Most of this is going to be very expensive, and so you're going to be reading, well, wait a minute. Rich people are using these, they're getting healthier. What about others? And it can affect medical care and other industries. And finally, going even deeper, well, how will these things affect societies? Particularly, how will it change governments? So I think there are different levels. I think cost-benefit analysis can help with the first one, but certainly I think we also have to think about different levels. So what are our takeaways? To start with, these food technologies, at least in my mind, are moving much faster than science and governance. And I think they are likely to drive consumer choice. And so that's a key thing that I don't think most people have thought about. And they're not only going to drive consumer choice, but the question is, are they going to drive consumer choice in the right way? And the emerging technologies I'm talking about, including the health and food intake monitors, additive printing, interactive GPS advice, and so forth. And these things may be interacting with enhanced humans, and that's a little bit farther down the road, but if you start reading about it now, you see people are already sort of taking that into account. I think benefit cost analysis can help us decide, because what we're going to need is a balance between this sort of pre-market approval mindset where nothing can go on the market until it's been tested and approved, and then progress toward solving some of these knotty problems that we have, such as obesity. So let me end with a plea, and I will sort of tell you my personal prejudice. I think we should embrace this new technological world. And instead of just seeing dangers, which many people tend to do, let's try to allow this technology to move forward to solve some of our health problems. In order to do that, I think we have to resist the idea that we have to control every single technological advance. But I also think we have to shine a spotlight on bad science when it's making its way into the public sphere. And I think we have to avoid policies like the plague that exist only to satisfy political desires. Instead, let's just focus on what works for public health. Thank you.
Hi, Josh Anthony, Campbell Soup Company. Thanks.
Is that on?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought that was an excellent and very thought-provoking talk. I have actually two questions, and I'd love any specific comments that you might have. You touched on how we do regulations and the need for change there. And your model necessitates that we break down a divide between a more, medical-oriented regulations and food-based regulations, right? Because we're really talking about a continuation of health. Mm-hmm. And then getting into the second question, so how might that be addressed to create a regulatory framework that allows for that? And then the second part of it is you touched on the idea of the 21st century superwoman. Very little of what we have done with respect to regulations, whether it be for food or disease, is based on optimization. So much of it has been based off of, as you said, the older framework of preventing disease. So I think in a lot of ways, we lack a definition of optimization to establish as a target, and we're not routinely funding it from a research standpoint. So how might we change the regulatory paradigm? But how might we change the scientific paradigm to better describe optimization, what that looks like, and then further extend the regulations to accompany that?
Yeah.
I know that a lot there, but I'd love your thoughts.
Okay. Well, so first off, it's been clear to me for some time, particularly with these new types of technologies, and I'm talking about not just the health technologies. We see it with Uber and Bitcoin and so forth. We really do need a new framework. 1946 was 75 years ago. I don't think the way we do regulations now, which has worked well for us, but no longer, I think we need a new regulatory framework where we have something that moves faster. And I don't know that we're ever going to be able to get there. I mean, I'm thinking of what's going on in Congress right now. I don't know that we're ever going to be able to get there with hard law, because when you think about what really does slow us up in Congress and in regulatory agencies, it's hard law, it's hard regulations. I think we're going to need soft law, but I think that soft law has to be tempered slightly. So there's sins of omission and sins of commission. If you have sins of commission particularly, and I think I'm not a lawyer, but I think there's a distinction in the law, I think that's where we need hard law. If you are literally putting out something out there that you know is bad, and if you think there was one food safety incident recently where we sent people to jail, I think you need that kind of hard law. For the rest of it, I think, and there will be lots of sins of omission, I think we really do need soft law. And I think what we've got to have is we've got to have people getting together and talking about where is this going, what are the problems, but also never have a committee where you say, what are the problems? But let's say, well, yeah, but what are the possibilities? What can help? And so one of the things that I think maybe for this organization we need, I'll just make a suggestion, is I think we need to start monitoring this. I think, I just sort of scratched the surface of it. I do think we need to start thinking about where is this going and how can we help and what science do we need. I'll repeat over and over again, I think we need better biomarkers and I think we need better statistical analysis, but also how to govern. So your second question was...
you touched on it to an extent, which is how do we start setting a scientific standard for what optimization looks like?
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to set a standard for optimization, because if you think about how these technologies go, we could sit here and maybe we could all agree on the standard right now, and there's millions of people out there doing their own thing, and we could say, here's the optimization standard, and they're just going to move. And so the question is, we're trying to move something that's very big, very complex, your VUCA analysis, and we're going to try to play catch up. So the first thing we can do is we can figure out what the heck is going to happen here and how can we make sure that it goes in a good direction. Again, we don't want to set up a lemons market. We don't want the bad competition. So we should start by just trying to figure out what's coming and what kind of science do we need and what kind of regulatory structures do we need before people jump in and go, okay, well, we've done a little bit of thinking about this. Let's just have pre-market approval and shut this whole thing down. Where in fact, there's possibilities for great advancements.
Maha.
Maha Tahiri from General Mills. So first, thank you very much for the very inspiring talk. I will never forget that woman flying, because I get a little bit of that when I'm scuba diving in a very strong current, but I'm sure nothing like that. I have a comment. So if you look at the strategic plan of FDA, I think they're starting to get it, because there's a section about digitalization of health. And I have a question, and my question is about if you have a perspective on the acceptance or the stickiness of this very inspiring future that we could have, depending on the cultures or on the preference. There's a very strong area of consumers that could really would like to rely on mostly their intuition versus data. So the acceptance of data in consumer choice is not universal. And then there are whole cultures, if you go globally, that think that the way they eat is their identity and it's their tradition, and they've had it for many centuries. So I would love to have your perspective on how you integrate that into model.
Sure. There are always, with every technology, there are the first movers, the risk takers, right? The people like, I don't care what it is, I want to try it. And that's usually, younger people. And that's what we already see. I saw a video a couple years ago, and it was about people who had physical deformities and who were in one way or the other, handicapped in one way or the other, and they talked about, we're not interested in being normal like you. If we want a prosthetic limb, we want to be better than you. We want to be faster than you. So there's another group. Now I can't speak to cultures, I'm sure, and as you all know, there's a movement now toward let's go back, let's eat whole foods, plant-based, which that's great. It'll make people healthier. But I do think there's that core set of people, and you know them. There are already kids, and I do not understand this, who are putting magnets into their fingertips. I don't understand what that's for, but somehow they think that's enhancing them. I don't get it. But I do think, look, when this is available, it's just like, who knew you needed a Dick Tracy thing to wear to communicate? Once it was there, everybody goes, well, whatever it is, I got to have it. And so I think that's what's going to happen. As these things get produced, more and more people are going to go, I got to have it. And I think the other thing is, look, the potential is there. If you make healthy eating easy, you don't have to learn anything. I personally would like that. So I think it's great.
Hi, Paul Hanlon from Abbott Nutrition. Great talk, and I think one of the things that you mentioned a lot of times, and even here in the responses, is biomarkers. And actually, maybe tying that back to what you led off with is consumer confusion. And I think one of the things that we've seen in some of the committees that I work on is there's a difference between a biomarker and a false biomarker. And I think that is leading to a lot of consumer confusion with, you have reporters that always have news of, well, these 3 things changed and now you're going to have less risk of cancer. When in fact those biomarkers are not truly biomarkers of whether you're going to get heart disease or cancer. So what can we do about this prevalence of false biomarkers out in the media and within science? Is there some way that soft law can step in and provide some sort of guidance for how these things are being used?
I would be very reluctant to have any sort of law involved in picking the right biomarkers. And maybe the right biomarker isn't the same for everybody. Maybe there are different biomarkers for different people, because it may be, depending on your genetic history and your lifestyle, maybe you're more concerned about cancer than heart disease, for example, or Parkinson's. So I don't know, but my main point in raising it is it's essential that we have biomarkers that work. Otherwise, this whole market, this whole learning, what will you be learning based on? It's not going to work unless we have the biomarkers. So I'd like to turn it back to you as an expert and say, please work on this. And even if your biomarker is probability-based, that's fine, right? Probability that if you have this change in this biomarker, there's a higher probability that you'll get heart disease. I think that's perhaps better than something that's more definitive. So, but I wouldn't, boy, don't get lawmakers or regulators involved in that. Let's leave it to the scientists, the real experts.
Eric has a question here.
I'll let Jim.
Okay.
Jim.
Yeah, Jim Hill, University of Colorado. I really enjoyed that. And if you look at why people aren't eating healthy right now, I think we're asking people to oppose both their biology and their environment. And what you talked about were some things that can make the environment a little easier. I think the missing thing here really is still the motivation for change. We see a lot of people who come in and want to lose weight, and they say, well, I don't really want to change what I eat. I don't want to give up the food I like. I don't really want to exercise, but I want to weigh less. I think one of our real challenges is, what's the real reason people want to make these changes? Let's face it, life is pretty good. We live a long time, we're healthier, etc. I really agree with you on the 21st century. The way I look at it is, we focused in the past on preventing the bad stuff. Now we can focus on accumulating the good stuff. But is that alone a motivation for change? I think the science of behavior change and finding that real deep motivation for change is something we're still going to have to do, even if your future comes true.
I think that's an excellent point. I just look at this, what may be a huge waste of money, $60 billion every year people spend on diets. And so clearly there's some desire out there to do better, right? But I guess I go back to, it's very hard to do that. It's hard to stick to a diet. In fact, I guess, and I leave it to the experts in this room, you're probably better off not having a diet. You're probably better off just saying, how am I going to eat for the rest of my life? How am I going to change? And I do think that technology can help if it's made easier, if particularly if, as you say, there are cultural ways that we eat. But what if, your AI technology is taking that into account? I know what foods you like. I know what your taste is like. I'm going to find something that fits your nutritional needs, and it's something that you like, and it fits your culture, and it fits something you can afford, and it's easy. To me, that's always the key. If you make it easier, consumers will come. And I think that's what I see, and I predict that there's just going to be a huge drive to get into this market. And we're already seeing it. It's in different forms. What I'm suggesting is it's going to be a lot more. There's going to have a lot more data going into this, and hopefully it will be better. So I'm hopeful.
On a more near-term specific prediction for this happening, Dietary Guidelines for 2020 will probably start sometime, but think about 2025. If personalized nutrition, these algorithms and acceptance and all this happens in the next 7 years, what's going to be the point of...
Well, and perhaps it just has to change, right? If I'm sitting on that panel and I see these things coming about, and it may be like most technologies, some of it's working very well, some of it's good, some of it's not so good. Maybe what the Dietary Guidelines Committee is going to be doing is, well, let's talk about these technologies. Let's talk about how they can be improved. Let's talk about what doesn't seem to be working. And again, we'll still be there in 2025. They're going to say, what science do we need? We need better statistical analysis. We need better biomarkers. And we need to help the regulatory agencies who people are going to turn to go, hey, can you make sure nothing bad happens? And they're like, well, maybe.
Allison?
Question. I want to go back to, you talked about, we used to always say we need more science, but now we have the artificial intelligence data, so we can build off of that and use that. So in regards to post-market or pre-market approval of ingredients, what kind of data are you thinking about, or were you thinking about purely in the dietary intake and the new technologies and tools?
Well, yeah, one of the things that, I don't say it worries me, but if you think about additive manufacturing, the 3D printers, I think 3D printers for food, it's going to be like computers. Everybody's going to have one in their house. Maybe you're going to toss out your microwave and you're going to have a 3D printer. So this is going to be really basic ingredients, right? And it's going to be, I can't pronounce this word, it's going to be like what they use in hospitals, total parenteral, is that right? Nutrition, where you basically... Parenteral, thank you.
Yeah.
Where you try to give people everything they need. So one of the things that you're going to want to know is, really, I mean, if you think about the complexities of food, what is everything? How are we going to know that if that's what you're using to make food, how are you going to know that, it really contains everything? And I think that's going to be a little difficult. Also, clearly, we're going to have food safety concerns as well with these machines. So I think a big problem is, how are we going to know, if people are trying to make food that way, that they're actually getting what they need? To me, that's a big problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.